Hi there and welcome to Psych Attack. I'm Dr. Jasmine B. MacDonald. In this episode, I catch up with Dr. Averil Cook to discuss political psychology and ways of applying systemic therapeutic approaches. I hope you're going well and have settled in with a warm cup of tea. Hey there, Averil. Thank you for joining me today.
Hey, Jasmine. Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I'm excited to have a chat. I'm wondering, to start with though, what are your plans for the weekend? You and your family still in lockdown?
Yes. Oh my gosh,
What will
I
be
think
happening in your household?
be a whole lot of exciting things like going for wholesome walks for a maximum of 1 hour. Probably listening to my own podcast as a way to kill the time. Playing with my
Yeah,
dog. Yeah.
nice. What do you listen to?
Yes. Oh, well, the last one I just was listening to was I'm Not a Monster. If you haven't listened to it, you must listen to it. It is so
Oh,
good. So good.
what is
It's
it?
well, it's about this woman, this US born citizen who married this guy and then ended up in Syria with her children. And she was trying to come back to the US saying that she had been tricked into going there. She was ended up being her husband ended up becoming an ISIS fighter, and it's like unpacking what actually happened and the psychology behind what she did and why she did this, and it's incredible.
Oh, that sounds really
Definitely watch.
interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to add that to the list. Um,
Yes, really good.
I've been listening to I Spy, which is
Okay.
all of these kind of counterintelligence stories from
Ooh,
around the
haven't
world.
heard
That
this.
one's really cool
I
as well.
spy. Okay,
Yeah.
I always like having
Look
a
at
collection of
this.
podcasting.
Yeah. Recording a podcast episode and sharing
Yes.
different tips. I love this. Amazing. It's good to crowdsource your the next thing to listen to. You don't have to do your own research that
Definitely.
way.
Yep, and you don't have to weed through the crappy ones.
Yeah, that's right. Alrighty, so we're here today to have a chat about the various kinds of work that you do in the area of political psychology and systemic therapeutic approaches. But a lovely place to start would be for you to tell the listeners about yourself, your background, and kind of how you came into psychology.
Yeah, I identify in so many different ways. And I remember saying to you just earlier, I don't know how to identify myself in this podcast. And you encouraged me to just say all the parts of me. So I will have a go at doing that. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I have been practicing for a number of years as a therapist, as a clinician, someone who works with adults, with families, with teenagers in a variety of settings. And then in my later years of work, I've also moved a little more into the research realm and moved into academia, where I have been doing a lot more of the supervision of upcoming psychologists and teaching the program and organizing the program in the master's format. So I've been doing that a lot recently. And then on the side, I do little projects like training workshops in the areas I'm interested in. So, particularly things like family therapy and trauma and working with complex cases. And I also I provide supervisor training to people who want to become accredited supervisors for psychs. So that's some of the things that I do. And I obviously do a lot of research as well in those areas that I'm interested in exploring more about and understanding. And so through various projects and relationships, I've come to be able to explore through research to be able to unpack a little more around those topics that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I feel like every time I talk to you, I learn something new about what you're working on and how you're, doing these really interesting things. And I think that was a nice tip of the iceberg of the aspects of Avril. So thank you for that. Could we go back a little even before that? What brought you to
Mm.
psychology?
Such a good question. I actually originally wanted to be a journalist. And I think the
Ah,
things that
samey.
yeah. I think that the things that made me interested in journalism originally is also what made me interested in psychology. I guess finding out the exploration, the discovery of what might be happening either with an individual or a situation or a story, and exploring that. I was always interested in more the investigative journalism side of things. And I guess I actually wrote in my local paper and realized that journalism was not for me because I wasn't interested in reporting the local soccer matches of the under 15s. And I went, I might need to do this for quite some time before I get to do the 7:30 report. And so I guess that led me to psychology, where I was able to, from the get-go, get into the juicy issues, the juicy topics. So I was always very interested in, I guess, the political issues and issues that faced me as an individual, and understanding maybe some of the principles of why people do what they do and why groups do what they do. And I guess that's what led me into the study of psychology.
I was recently on, I think, Facebook or something, and a friend of mine posted this generic post that was like, "What did you want to be when you were younger?" And I just replied, "April." April from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm pretty sure that's where my interest in journalism came from.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so
Yes. Well, mine was Penny from Inspector Gadget. You remember
also
Penny?
loved Penny. Also loved
Yes.
Penny.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, now I just want to hit pause and go be nostalgic and watch a bunch of cartoons and eat
Yes.
cereal.
Brilliant. I love it. And watch
My
reruns.
weekend plans. Yeah. So I had to share that love for April, even though you gave me a beautiful segue into what I was wondering next, which is when you say, this interest that you have in political psychology. What is that? Say you're at a barbecue or a picnic or something, and you're trying to explain to someone who might not really have a background in social science or psychology. How would you describe political psychology?
Oh, I think that I would probably not necessarily have a definition that may exist out there, but I guess the way I would describe it from my perspective is how to get involved and be socially aware of the issues that are facing people, particularly for me in the current times, or affects me as an individual or the groups that I work with a lot. So, some examples are, how are we affected as women in this society? How are we affected as people from culturally diverse backgrounds, whatever they may be? I myself am half Chinese, and I have different aspects in my background, and exploring those, and also understanding how that intersects with being a professional in a very westernized society that really values whiteness and Western culture. So it's sort of how those types of issues intersect with how we understand people and their behavior, and how we have relationships with one another, and why we do what we do. So I guess it's got a bit more of a political lens. It's got a bit more of a socially cultural awareness to it, than, say, perhaps traditional psychology, which is, because it is very westernized, it's very individually focused.
Yeah, and those looking for commonalities across an individual's experience, yeah, at an individual level rather than
Mm.
thinking more broadly. 'Cause it's not just social psych though, like
Yeah.
this is not the same as that. It's that systemic influences on the way
Hmm.
people experience their lives. So
Exactly.
yeah, your broader approach is systemic therapeutic approach. And what does
Mm.
that look like?
It's kind of a cool concept, because you're right, it does step outside of just psychology, as a discipline. It's something that governs behavior and groups, and you can have a system in the ecosystem, and it's got similar principles to it as it applies to a group of people. And a system, say for example, a company or an organization is a system, a family is a system, the environment and how it intersects with how the parts of it work within one another is also a system, like an ecosystem. So I guess it's understanding the principles of how systems work, how they tend to operate, and what can happen when we move and tweak one aspect of that system. What are the ripple effects, or what are the patterns in which this can influence other aspects of the system? So I guess, no matter what we're looking at, we do have general principles that govern all of these systems. And then there's the more minute study of particular systems, like a family unit or a society or a cultural group or a business organization. And that's what I'm thinking
Mm,
about when I think about a system.
mm. Yeah, I think that's a really nice, kind of clear description. I always, in my own work, am thinking about even when studying the individual level of symptoms in trauma and occupational stress,
Mm.
in terms of the conclusions and recommendations, trying to think at that micro, meso, macro level.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a little gem that I have always taken from my social work training.
yeah, yeah.
That sounds like this is coming very natural to exactly what you're talking about here.
Exactly. Yes. And then you're right in saying that this is a far stronger tradition in social work than it is in psychology. So you do get taught about these concepts at a very fundamental educational level, which psychologists don't. But it is something, I guess, that I'm quite passionate about bringing to psychology and bringing as a lens and one other aspect of understanding people and behavior and relationships.
So, in taking this approach to your practice and the way that you teach and supervise and your research, what are the key assumptions that you're challenging?
I would say that it affects almost every single aspect of the work we do as psychologists. There isn't one area that it doesn't touch. And I think that's why I have been so passionate about bringing these ideas and these influences to psychology in the way that it has already been a tradition in social work for a long time, because it is so fundamental to the work that we do. And I guess particularly because psychology has been more conservative than social work, we do have a very individual westernized concept that hasn't been influenced by other cultures. It hasn't been influenced by other research from different areas, uh, either culturally or conceptually in the study of psychology. And so I guess what I the way that I view it is that psychology has had such tunnel vision in looking at the individual and their intrapsychic world that they've failed to really acknowledge our environment. And nobody exists in a vacuum. And that is so important to understanding what happens for individuals, and how we can understand and, I guess, help and support people is not just through intrapsychic means and what happens inside their head or their bodies or their heart on their own, but how they're connected fundamentally with other human beings. Because as human beings, we're social creatures. And I think if we can understand this, and can have a really well tuned understanding of how the individual operates within their context and how the context influences the individual, you've got a much more thorough and complete picture of a complex situation than if you're just looking at the individual. So I would say that if it affects everything in psychology.
All right, we've got a sense of what kind of constitutes political psychology and what a systemic therapeutic approach is. What does that look like? Share with us some of the things that you've worked on
Okay.
as some examples.
Some of the work I have done is, for instance, done the occasional pro bono job for a NGO working with refugees. I have in the past worked with refugees internationally, with people who have been political prisoners or caught in detention in Australia and needing sort of psychological reports. Some projects for Anti Slavery Australia, where I've met people who have been enslaved in Australia and have done reports for them in aid of whatever they're needing at that particular time. That's systemic because it's doing what I believe in, and it is doing the work in an area that may not have funding or money, or where people are disadvantaged and not able to access these services easily. And then I've been involved in more of a structural sense in the organisations I've been involved with. So in my work at ACAP, the Australian College of Applied Psychology, I've been very vocal in bringing cultural diversity and decolonising the practice of psychology to the studies through our reworking of the master's training programs, through the lectures that I deliver in those psychology programs, as well as, doing those sorts of guest lectures for the undergrad program as well. And in doing that, what I am trying to do is actually ensure that the next generation of psychologists doesn't have this attitude of, I do my real work, and then maybe there's sometimes this work that I have to do a bit differently for someone who is from a different cultural background. And I don't actually really know how to do that, or I don't actually really know how it relates.
I chuckle because it makes me think of psychology textbooks where here's the main
Yeah.
theory and research. Oh, here's a chapter about working in a culturally diverse context or working with
Yes.
Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander Australians instead
Yeah.
of having that more integrated, because the
Exactly.
key risk here is when you don't, being more mindful of the colonized aspects or the
Mm.
the white middle upper class aspects of psychology and taking those for granted is really damaging.
Yes, absolutely. And I know when I went through my training, it was, an Indigenous perspective was literally a lecture tagged onto the end of some random subject. And that was the entirety of our teaching and our knowledge and our understanding of working with Indigenous clients. And so I mean, I guess I'm talking about a few parallels here is like I'm creating systemic change in actually imbuing our philosophy and our attitude towards psychology by providing students with a lens that the tradition and the history of psychology is very white, it is very male, middle class
Hmm.
focused, and we need
Oh yeah, I
to be
left male
critical.
out.
Yes, yes. I mean, in one of my lectures, I literally Googled famous psychologists and then I took a screenshot of the pictures that came up, and they were all white, male, and usually like in their 50s or 60s.
Bearded. Yeah.
Bearded. Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what psychology is, and this is the product of these people, and it probably only relates to them and their cultures. And so for us as psychologists, we need to be critical about that. And we need to understand where it applies and where it does not apply,
Yeah.
and what we do instead when it doesn't apply. So, for instance, a very common example is that obviously CBT is very well understood, it's very well researched, it is considered the gold standard for, lots of different disorders. Let's just take depression as a very common example. But the research that's conducted, the RCT trials that are done in these areas are really about very simple types of individuals with simple types of problems. So, because of the way research is constructed, we cannot have an individual who has depression, who also has trauma, who is suicidal, who is, complex, because you can't isolate exactly specifically whether this treatment works then for depression. Then as a result, what we get is a treatment that works purely for depression, but perhaps fits almost nobody that's going to walk through your door. So, so then when you have cultures that have not even had these measures or these therapeutic approaches tested on them or based around anything that makes sense to them as human beings and their cultures, we are taking a huge leap of faith, and we can't actually assume to know that these treatments work, for example, for Indigenous populations. So I think that's what I'm really trying to bring to psychologists of the current generation, is having this ability to be critical about what psychology tells us is true. And to use their own minds as we do develop more research and do develop more practices that may be tailored from particular cultural groups that say, hey, this is a treatment that actually might be really useful for my community, rather than it being driven by white privileged people who are often take up the bulk of the psychology workforce. So that's something that I'm doing in a university level. And then there's sort of little projects that I have been doing as well, which are in line with, I guess, my systemic unpacking of injustice and issues that are facing people today. Within the recent history of Black Lives Matter, there's been a lot of conversation, particularly in Australia, more so than we've ever had before, around these issues of how we treat non-white community members. In Australia, it's not just Black people, it's Indigenous, it's Muslim, it's Chinese, many different cultural groups. In the wake of Black Lives Matter, I was contacted by a higher ed organisation who were having a lot of difficulties with their student population and the backlash that they were receiving for being a very white, and the criticism was racist organisation, and how to deal with that. And that's something that I am very passionate about as well, is helping organisations which maybe have a lot of history in colonial white Australia to break down those systemic barriers to having diversity in their student cohort, in their staffing cohort, in their policies, in their practices, which I guess is only now something that Australia is really taking a good look at to see how it affects and discriminates against certain parts of the population. and how it hurts a big part of our population. So, in doing my work with that organisation, what I was looking at was understanding the experiences of the Indigenous and culturally diverse students in the community, the staff, but also looking at the perspectives of the white students and the staff members who were from the dominant group, and how they understood the situation that was unfolding. And we had a look at policies and practices within that organisation, such as how do you have communications with your students? How do you have involvement around different areas of concern for your different cultural groups? How do you enforce your policies? So, for example, sick leave or extensions. What is your perspective on when that's allowed and when that's not allowed? Um,
Right.
are you enforcing your anti-discrimination laws that we're all governed by, or are you not? So all at all these levels, really unpacking where it was going wrong and providing suggestions to increase the cultural diversity and strength of the organisation.
That actually sounds like a massive undertaking. So worthwhile and so interesting, but
Yeah.
it sounds massive.
It was massive. I did not do it alone. I did it with my colleague C Liu as well, who is a an amazing psychologist and someone who also very passionate around this type of work. And it was a big project. It was very interesting. It was very exciting, and I hope we get to do some more of it down the track.
Broadly, I'm wondering about the potential resistance that you might get when you're addressing such important but systemic issues. You may or may not want to speak to how you presented those findings to that educational institution. But broadly, is this something that you're thinking about when you're meeting with people and giving feedback on these kind of projects? Is how do we feedback what might be really challenging for people to hear, but they really need to hear it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It is all about the delivery, and it's all about pitching your communication appropriately at your audience. There's different schools of thought about how to do this, but what C and I did together was very carefully thought about the groups that we were speaking to. So we deliberately chose to meet the students who are Indigenous and from culturally diverse backgrounds separately. We chose to speak to different groups depending on what kind of information and the level of sensitivity of the information that we needed to obtain, because there is the potential for a lot of harm and violence to be done through people's imbued and casual racism that's maybe not intentioned, but because we've all been raised in this environment where racism is just in the air we breathe, it can take a lot of unpacking. I daily have to unpack my own racism. And that may sound really surprising from someone who comes from also very mixed racial background, but it affects all of us. And so there is a real need to almost have a trauma informed kind of practice when you are having these conversations, to ensure that you're protecting the people who are bringing up, or maybe required to bring up, a lot of very distressing information, and to also have an environment where people who may not have ever experienced this or ever had to think about this can query and question and ask openly without having to be anxious that they might upset someone, or might be saying something insensitive. So I guess there's the needs, very different needs, and you do have to be very mindful of that. The other thing when you're doing this is that you have to have the people in leadership alongside with you. There is very little that you can actually do to create change if you don't have the willingness and the conviction of people in leadership. So these conversations are still important to be had, but you're not going to be able to make very structural, systemic changes without that. In this instance, we were very fortunate to have that from the board, from the CEO, and it was directed and pushed from them. So as a matter of, providing ongoing education to them, and, articles, resourcing, there is a lot of resourcing out there around how organisations can increase their cultural diversity, how they can decolonize their policies and their practices. So, going to industry specific guidance on that. As a consultant in that space, it's about understanding that everyone is actually coming from a different starting point, and you need to be able to join them at wherever they're at in their journey. It is going to be a place where you are going to be met with a lot of differences of opinions and attitudes that may be really different to your own, and sort of being able to kind of sit with that and gently challenge that. on one hand. And then on the other hand, if you do have the power to actually still create that change despite those attitudes being present. So, for instance, there are going to be some people who do want to learn and come along for the journey, who may struggle, who may have to think things through and reflect. And there are going to be other people who really don't want to budge or shift their position. And I guess as an organization or a group of people, you have to decide what you stand for at the end.
And any kind of learning and changing of perspective is actually uncomfortable. I found this
Very.
through teaching psychology is you can have people who are really motivated and keen to learn and develop and change in
Mm,
general until something that really shakes the perspectives that they have
yeah.
comes along, and then there's resistance and distress, and depending on the
Yes.
personality, all these different potential kind of reactions.
Yes. I think what's really important to note here as well is, I mean, I'm again referring to systemic understanding, is we might be having this conversation with a particular group, maybe a psychology tutorial group that's in front of you, an organization that has come to address these issues, or you're doing a lecture. And those people all sit within a context. And the context is our society in Sydney at the moment, for instance, or in Australia. And I think part of the conversation is preempting where they will be at because of where Australia is up to. And Australia is very young in this conversation. South Africa, for instance, have been dealing with these issues for such a long time, and their thinking and their social psyche is far more developed and complex in understanding these issues because they've had to, whereas we haven't. Australia has really never had the Black Lives Matter moment. We've tried to, we've had that opening, but it hasn't been as huge as some of the other countries, like the US and South Africa historically. So, preempting these conversations with, we have never had to think about this in a big way in Australia. Indigenous people think about it daily, experience it daily. People from migrant communities also think about it and experience it daily. But as a community, it has not been within our narrative. And so we're very young in our understanding. And this is the context in which our audience is largely going to be sitting in, is a lot of white people have never had to think about this. So by acknowledging that straight up front and preempting their resistance, that can also be helpful in them taking a step back and saying, this might be why I'm experiencing resistance. And that's okay. And it's still my responsibility to learn. And it's still my responsibility to reflect.
Mm. Many people haven't had an experience of even being referred to by a racial category. I remember going
Mm.
to Singapore and getting in an Uber, and the driver was talking to us, and he said, "Oh, I was doing this, and it was with Caucasians like you." And I
Mm.
remember like reflecting and going, "Hey, I don't know if I've ever been referred
Yeah.
to or categorized in that way." And as you
Yeah.
say, other people experience this all the time.
Mm.
um, and even that experience, like that's nothing, that's not even
Mm.
something
Yeah.
that's almost worth noting. But it was that, for me, was a really interesting experience to go, yeah, when you have an experience where you're not in the majority or the mainstream
Mm.
and
Mm.
categorized in some way, it makes you think
Yeah.
about yourself differently.
Absolutely. Like that's an example of you being othered. You were considered other. And how surprising that is when you haven't had that experience before. Absolutely. I mean, I was having this conversation. I had one of these lectures with my postgrad students, and there was quite a diverse group there. And because psychology is so white, a lot of these people in my class had said to me, I have never had to think about this within the context of me being a psychologist in this way. So, what happens to people from different cultures when they come into the profession of psychology and they have to be white in order to practice as a psychologist and to think as a psychologist? And now I'm hoping to have conversations with these students as well about, what do you bring from your cultural understanding, and how do you think about things from your cultural lens, and how can that intersect with what we know in psychology and what we don't know. And so even just having these conversations, like for white students, they said, I'd never thought about culture and how this affects me as a therapist. For people from different backgrounds, saying it affects me daily, but I've never had to think about it in terms of me as a professional, shows how divorced these two issues have been in psychology for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I remember having a chat with a third year psych student, and they were talking about what they were going to go on and do and what their aspirations were after honors and going into a master's program. And this student was saying to me, I want to work with clients who have PTSD and depressive symptoms. But she was explaining to me that she would need to work with Malaysian clients because that was her background. And it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a desire to work within her community.
Mm.
It was like an assumption that she'd absorbed almost through her training,
Ah,
that because she
yeah,
was a Malaysian student, that's where she would be best fit.
yeah.
That's really concerning,
It
like,
is.
and
It
I
is.
I wonder if, when you're talking about this being like a young area in Australia,
Mm.
and within the discipline. I think sometimes when things are young and a new thing, we go straight to what are the challenges and the issues and problematize things.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
the layering of disadvantage to be
Yeah,
black, to be a woman, all these different things. But
yeah.
it's always from, to start with, a negative perspective instead of seeing the strength in this
Strengths.
perspective.
Mm.
What is
Mm.
it that Indigenous Australians do so well that
Yes.
can inform psychological practice? So, what is it
Yeah.
about this culture that is so adaptive or resilient? It kind of feels like that's where we're at.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and I think in a way that's because the narrative is largely driven by the dominant culture, and the dominant culture's assumptions and heuristic is other is less than, and disadvantage, and that is a patriarchal message. It's we are the caregivers, we are the knowledge holders, and we will share this with the poor, you know, groups that have less than us. And that is an inherently racist assumption, because I think if you were to approach, particular, say, an Indigenous group, they would have a very different perspective on what it is that they bring and what it is that their culture gives them that the dominant culture would not have an awareness of.
What are some well earned tips or experiences you can share for people to be keeping this in mind when they're in a classroom or when they're working with a client or when you're doing research?
I might talk a bit about the therapeutic side of things because I don't think I've spent as much time talking about that. And I think that was my first home. That was my first passion area. And I still do a bit of teaching in family therapy and systemic therapy. And I guess what the way that this comes into the therapy room is through understanding the person who has come to see you with problems, issues, concerns, and understanding them within their context. Now, unfortunately, because we do come from a very Western medical model perspective, it will be one individual that is coming to you because of our referral systems, because of our how we understand patients, and how we categorize and channel people through a health system is very much identified or based around you are the sick person, we will give treatment to you as the sick person. So whilst a patient is coming to you or a client is coming to you as an individual, understanding that it may not be actually them that needs the treatment, it may not be them that has the entire solution within them or is the cause of the issues that they're facing, and so therefore they may not within themselves have the ability to actually change everything about the issues that they're facing.
Hmm.
If you have that perspective, then you start to naturally think through, well, who are those people? Who are those key relationships? Who are those key communities? And how can I access them? And how can I actually bring them into the therapy room in a way that you may not have if you're thinking that the entire solution lies within the individual in front of me? So I think probably some of the most complex cases I have ever worked on in my entire career has always involved more than just one person in the room. And usually the most complex cases involve the entire family. It'll involve entire systems, so the police system, facts or now known as DCJs. It may involve communities and community members because this is their support structure, and this is the structure that influences and teaches and holds to account the people you're working with. So in those really complex cases, those people are so important to utilize and to bring their knowledge of the situation and their influences into the room. On a really, I guess, less complex end, it may simply mean if you're seeing an adult, asking them who the people are in their lives, who are their support structures, who are what are their social networks like, what are their work, employment, study networks like. We know that people who suffer the most are those that don't have good social connections. They might be migrants, or they might be international students, or they may have just moved interstate to pick up a new job. They might be isolated by their identity, like, they're LGBTQI plus, and they're not accepted within the place that they've moved, or they haven't found their people yet. You need to know about these things in order to be able to help the individual in front of you. And you need to know how to help your client access those and value those things in order to aid them in their own support and recovery. So I suppose that would be sort of the first thing I'd say about therapy is bringing other people into the room, bringing other people either conceptually or physically into the therapy room in front of you. When you've got children, that's also going to mean schools. And I mean very actively including schools in your strategies for helping the family. Your implementation, your gathering of information has to come from all these different sources.
What's next for you? Like, what projects are you working on, or things that people could keep an eye out on, or that they should know about?
I think one of the things that I've got coming up is my business, where I'm wanting to work with different organizations and different key people to actually keep doing projects in the various areas I am passionate about. So, in terms of teaching and education, I am going to be doing decolonizing psychology workshop, which I've had a bit of interest in from clinicians. So that will be coming out shortly. It'll be coming out via my page, which will be www.bodhiandpsychology.com.au, and Bodhi is Bodhi. I will be working on some more projects in that field, taking that to organisations as well, working with a great org psychologist called Associate Professor Madeleine Geldenhuis, and she's going to kill me for that pronunciation because it is a very poor pronunciation of an Afrikaans name. And she also works in this field as well. I do have a number of exciting research projects which I'm quite passionate about. And again, bringing my values and social justice kind of lens to it. One I'm working on with Southwestern Sydney LHD, and we're looking at the effects of climate change on mental health, and in particular the effects of heatwave events on populations in the southwest of Sydney, and whether or not people turn up to emergency departments with psychological distress. I guess this is another way that I sort of bringing together my systemic understanding and interests is this is one of the biggest crises of our time, and I don't know that psychology has really paid much attention to how this will affect people and their mental health. And we're wanting to have a look, I guess, compare heatwave event periods to non-heatwave event periods, and in particular to look at those from marginalised populations, so Indigenous cold communities, and whether or not it affects those communities to a greater extent than wealthier, more privileged communities. So that's actually going through ethics at the moment, and I have a few students from ACAP joining me in on that, which will be exciting, and should be able to get a fair bit of data, hopefully, over the next few years that we can kind of ask a few more interesting questions around.
I mean, you can't get much more person in context than considering climate change and the environment and how that's impacting people.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other projects that I'm also working on is working with Southeastern Sydney LHD, and we're looking at a project which helps divert mental health populations that may have ended up in emergency departments by the development of a team called the PACER team. And the PACER team consists of sort of a mental health clinician alongside emergency services like police, ambulance. And the idea is that as a mobile team, they go out to people's homes, or they go out to the streets and out to the community when people may be acutely distressed or unwell, and actually assess and triage and evaluate people in distress in the community, rather than people by and large would be scheduled, taken to hospital, or traumatic experiences assessed in an emergency department. The emergency department is already overloaded and clogged, and it's a really trauma-informed environment and quite a distressing experience. And by and large, those mental health patients are assessed and taken back into the community with no extra benefit for having gone through that process. So we're wanting to have a look on how these teams are impacting the types of patients' journeys. So, are they able to stay in their communities? Are they able to get linked up with a more appropriate services? Are they having a better experience because they are having a mental health clinician at their first point of contact? And is this also then influencing our emergency services and helping them feel more supported in mental health presentations? That's a pretty exciting project as well, just trying to see how, as a system, we can actually better treat our mental health consumers.
Demonstrating a shift in typical approach from the mental health professional, the police officer, the various systems that an individual might come into contact with, rather than expecting the individual to shift.
Yes, exactly.
So when those projects wrap up, we'll do more episodes then to hear
Excellent.
all about what you
I would love
found.
that. I would love that. Yeah, and just hopefully a lot of exciting different ideas coming up through the company and picking up projects as they come through and working with different exciting people whose passion areas, Madeleine's is org psych, and we're going to do some in that area. I'll probably do some more things in looking at supervision as well for psychologists down the track and giving them a lot more support and structure than they currently have. But watch this space, and hopefully we'll get to have a chat again sometime soon.
I would very much enjoy that. I've really enjoyed catching up with you today, and I feel like we have covered a lot of ground.
Mm.
And that goes back to exactly what you were saying at the start. It's not a specific context or a specific issue that we need to apply these things in. It is across the board and something kind of omnipresent,
Mm.
whether we acknowledge it or
Yeah.
not. So, this super awesome conversation, Avril.
Thanks,
Thank you
Chaz.
so
Thank you
much.
so much. Thanks for having me. And I really enjoyed the conversation too. Some great questions there.
For those of you at home, that's all for today. Show notes for the episode can be found at www.psychattack.com. If you've enjoyed listening to Psych Attack, please rate it on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode to help other people find the show. If you have questions or feedback, you can reach out on Twitter at PsychAttackCast. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch up with you again next time.